Khorne, and today I will be making a unit tier list and army guide for the Greenskins. I'll be ranking their units based on how useful they are in the single player campaign, both in terms of their convenience to recruit and their performance on the battlefield. Now, in order to rank their units, we first have to understand how the Greenskins fight battles. And even though they have one of the biggest unit rosters in the game, with many different unit types available to them, the only proper way for them to fight battles is to get stuck into melee and start smashing. This unfortunately kind of makes it so that the majority of their units that don't specialize in launching themselves headfirst into melee don't really fit all that well with their roster. And because of this, they end up having a lot of redundant units. So now that we have a basic understanding on how the Greenskins fight battles, let's start ranking their units based off of that. As per usual, I will be ranking their units into 5 different categories. Doomstack worthy, where these units are ridiculously strong and can be made unstoppable. Bread and butter, these units are the units you should have as the backbone of your armies. Situational units, units that aren't meant for every situation, but can be very useful in certain situations and against certain enemies. Expendable units, these units are there just to die and buy your other units time to dish out damage. And trash, where I would just recommend you not recruit these units. So, to start off with, let's have a look at our melee infantry. And here we have 2 distinct types of units, goblins and orcs. Starting with goblins, we have the basic goblins and the goblins with spears, which will both go into the expendable units category. And they're both cheap, do a decent job at bogging down enemy units, and are fairly easy to recruit and replace. Then we have the night goblins, the regular version, which I will place as trash. The reason being is that they are basically the same unit as regular goblins, only they're also able to stalk and have a bit more damage. But they are recruited from the same building from which you can get nasty skulkers. And nasty skulkers are a really good unit, with good killing power against any infantry, as well as having good utility on the battlefield, with them being able to stalk and having an ability to slow down enemy units around them. Unfortunately, they're nowhere near as good as they used to be, but are still strong enough that I will place them as a bread and butter. Then we have Night Goblin Fanatics, which I will place as a bread and butter. Unlike the regular version, they have an ability called Spinning Loons, which can dish out a lot of damage to enemy infantry units, making them much more useful. Then come your arguably less useful melee infantry, the orcs. Orc boys I will place as trash, while orc boys with spears I will place as expendable. Both of these units are rather bad for how much they cost, and they're recruited from the same building, but spears can at the very least hold the line marginally longer, making them a bit more useful. Savage orc boys I will place as situational, with the only time they will ever be useful is in the beginning of a Warhammer campaign. But aside from that, you simply get them way too late into the game for you to make any good use of them. Next come Orc Boy Biggins and Savage Orc Boy Biggins, which both of them I will place in the bread and butter category. These units have decent damage, somewhat decent defenses, and enough speed to reliably get into melee before they get completely shot up by enemy range units. And finally come the Black Orcs, and I will say that both of these units belong in the trash category, simply because they are way too slow to reach the enemy before they get killed by range units, and even when they reach melee combat, I find that they don't really perform well enough to justify their price point. They're simply way too expensive and take twice as long to recruit to do a similar job as a lower tier unit with the big guns. Next up come the ranged infantry, and I will say that none of these fit the Greenskins playstyle of rushing into melee as quickly as possible. But most of these units are actually pretty decent in general. Goblin archers and night goblin archers I will have to say are situational units, as they can dish out a decent amount of damage, but they also have extremely short range, which means that you can't really use them reliably in a lot of situations. In the early game, they should perform well enough for you, but unless you're playing as Grom the Paunch, I would just recommend you replace them as soon as you're able to. Night Goblin Archer Fanatics, however, I will place as trash tier, because they're more expensive to recruit and maintain because of their Spinning Loons ability, but since they are a range unit, you will almost never be able to use this ability, so you're pretty much paying more for nothing in turn. Then come the Orc Airboys, which both the regular and savage variant I will place as situational. Basically, only really useful in the beginning of a campaign, but you will want to replace them later on. Next come all of your cavalry and chariots, which are actually units that will synergize well with the Greenskins playstyle. But this kinda makes it funny as to how hit and miss some of these units actually are. Starting with every Wolf Rider and Forest Spider Rider unit, both ranged and melee variants. All of them go into the trash category. All of these units have abysmally low stats with very low killing power. The range variants do next to no damage with their missiles, and the melee variants are only ever really useful when running down enemy fleeing units. For a race like Chaos Dwarfs, this would be fine since you will get more labor after a battle, but for Greenskins that don't get any special resource for running down enemy fleeing units, well, they're completely worthless. Wolf Rider Chariots fall into the same category as the previous units for the exact same reasons. And then come Squigoppas, which are probably the only Goblin unit to actually get buffed after the Omens of Destruction Goblin nerfs, and they will go into the bread and butter category. They are a cavalry unit with decent speed and a decent killing power against anything that is infantry sized. They can also get a decent amount of buffs from Night Goblin war bosses and through your technologies, which makes them perform extremely well. Next come all of the Orc Cavalry, and we first have Boar Boys as well as Savage Boar Boys that will both go into the situational category. They are a relatively good unit at getting into enemy range to deal with them, but they lack a bit of killing power versus basically anything else. So if you're in a desperate need for cavalry to shut down enemy range, they can be a decent enough option. As for Boar Boy Biggins and Savage Boar Boy Biggins, well, both of these go into the bread and butter category. They have much more damage than their previous versions and will be good in a lot more situations other than just running down enemy range. Now, even though Savage Boar Boy Biggins actually take 2 turns to recruit, which would make them normally worse than the regular version, they actually do get buffed heavily by the Savage Orc Shaman, which makes them perform amazingly well. As for Boar Boy Chariots, I have to say that I was genuinely impressed by this unit. They might not be as good as Gorby's Chariots, but they have decent mass with really good killing power versus infantry units. Not to mention they only take 1 turn to recruit, so I will say that they belong in the bread and butter category. Next up are War Machines, where we have artillery and pump wagons. And just like with the range infantry, artillery is not what Greenskins specialize in, so usually it isn't all that useful to get. Not to mention, they also have some of the worst artillery units in the game. Bow throwers are instantly gonna go into the trash tier. This unit has absolutely no damage, and you're better off just getting a Goblin Archer instead. Rock Lobbers, again, trash tier. The only use for this unit would be to destroy towers in sieges, but that's about it. And as for Doomdiver Catapults, I believe they are a trash unit. And the reason for this is that their shots are extremely accurate. So much so, in fact, that I found they will hit the same place in the center of an enemy unit continuously, even if they have already killed all of the models there, which will just lead to you wasting their ammo. Another big reason I place them as trash is that on higher difficulties where the AI dodges their artillery shots, it can dodge pretty much every single shot from the Doomdiver Catapult, leading to you just wasting all of their ammo and all of your balance of power. This is an instance of where a unit is completely countered by the AI being smart. So much so that this unit just becomes completely worthless. And in fact, it becomes extremely detrimental for you to have. Then come the pump wagons, and here I would say that the regular version you can recruit from your settlement buildings are going to be situational, while the rest will be trash. Simple reason being that you have much better units at the tier you get pump wagons. Like, you don't want to recruit a better version of a tier 2 unit at tier 3 when you can just get a much better unit altogether with Boar Boy Chariots. Next we have come to the monstrous units, and again, just like with the cavalry, these units are the units that will synergize really well with the Greenskins playstyle. First up we have Squig Herd, and I would say these ones are situational, best used against dwarfs in the early game or with Gorbad's tactics. But aside from that, they're not really a great unit. Then we have the Mangler Squigs, which I am hesitant to place as trash, even though they do belong there. They have good speed and are pretty good at killing infantry. The problem is that they rampage, which can make it so they get stuck into melee, and since they are unbreakable, usually they will just end up dying. The Night Goblin Big Boss does have an ability to make them stop rampaging, but it can be extremely unreliable if you have multiple units of Mangler Squigs in an army. I think I will place it as situational, since this is a really good unit, but it has a massive flaw which just makes me not want to recruit them unless I can get multiple Night Goblin Big Bosses in a single army. Then comes the Giant Meatball, the Colossal Squig, which I will place as a Doomstack tier. This unit has insane speed for how big it is. It has pretty decent damage, and it is relatively healthy. Not to mention you can get all of this at tier 4 with only 2 turns of recruitment. It has the same weaknesses as Mangler Squigs though, with having Rampage, but since it is a lot sturdier and isn't unbreakable, it will usually just run away if it ever gets close to dying. Next up are all of our troll units, and these are actually pretty good. I would say that the regular trolls are situational borderline trash, since they aren't amazing, but can somewhat be useful in the beginning of a campaign. When it comes to river trolls, I will say they are bread and butter. While not much better than regular trolls, they still only take 1 turn to recruit, and they provide a pretty decent debuff to the enemy. So what you can do is mix this unit in with your front line and have them perform a little bit better. And Stone Trolls I will place as a Doomstack tier. Even though Stone Trolls take 2 turns to recruit, they are extremely resistant to taking damage, and they dish out a lot of damage in turn. So they are extremely useful in your armies, or you can just make a Doomstack out of them. Then come the Giants, which, unless you're playing as Gorbad, I would say are trash. 2 turns to recruit, extremely vulnerable to range units, and overall, Stone Trolls or Colossal Squigs are just better. Next comes the Rogue Idol, which I will place as trash as well. Same problem as with the Giants, only they take 3 turns to recruit, which is way too long. It is a massive target for the AI to shoot, and even though they do a really good job in melee, getting to the front line is a challenge for them. And that is not even mentioning the cost of maintaining them. Finally come the Spiders, and the regular Arachnarok I will place as situational, while the Flinger I will place as Doomstack tier. The regular ones are really good at killing large units, but they pretty much suck at killing everything else. Not to mention, they are a big target for the enemy range units. While Flingers, even though they have the same weaknesses as the regular version, are also really good at dealing damage to infantry because of their range attack, which makes them ideal in basically every situation and against every enemy. And lastly, just to mention them at the end, your WA units. Super Squigs I will place as bread and butter. They're a unit you will recruit in an emergency when you just need to instantly recruit some units. Armor Squig Hoppas are just a better version of Squig Hoppas, so bread and butter again. Lava Spiders are situational since they have armor-piercing missiles which can actually dish out good damage. And Lava Arachnaroks are a Doomstack-worthy unit because of all of the area of effect damage-dealing abilities they have. Then come the Feral Wyverns, which go into the trash category, simple reason being Rampage, which puts them in the same category as Manticores, and Feral Hydras will go into the situational category, again because of Rampage, but it is strong enough with good stats and healing that it can somewhat overcome this handicap. Alright, and now we have come to the Lords and Heroes part of the video. And surprisingly enough, in comparison to their units, almost every character is pretty good for the Greenskins. Starting with the only bad option here, the Orc Warboss is the worst Lord type you can use, as they only provide some mediocre buffs to Orcs, and are a mediocre melee combatant. So I wouldn't really recommend having these guys lead your armies. Then we have Goblin Shamans, which are a decent lord option to use, as they provide some decent stats to their armies, and they are a spellcaster that can get a Ragnarok mount, which makes them really powerful on the battlefield. Next up are Night Goblin War Bosses, who are probably the best lord option when it comes to boosting Squig Oppas and Night Goblins in general. They are pretty much terrible for everything else though, as the only other thing they are is just a bad melee combatant. Finally, the best generic lord option you have are the Savage Orc Shamans. And these guys are really good spellcasters. They are a spellcaster of the Big Wa, have some unique and potent area of effect abilities that can completely turn the tide of battle in your favor, and they provide some really strong buffs to your Orc units, especially for your Savage Orc units. Next come your heroes, who basically follow the same logic as all the other races' heroes, one of each for all of your armies, with the exception of Black Orc Big Bosses and Night Goblin Big Bosses, who I would recommend you get multiple of in your armies. Black Orc Big Bosses can provide you with a melee attack buff to nearby units, and they can gang up on enemy characters, while Night Goblin Big Bosses can summon a multitude of squigs onto the battlefield, as well as provide buffs to squigs in their armies. The regular Goblin Big Bosses are a rather weak option, however, as they are pretty bad in melee, but you do need them in your armies because they provide you with a bonus to income from fighting battles. Shamans are rather weak spellcasters, both the Orcs and the Goblin version, but you will still want to have them in all of your armies. Night Goblin Shamans to debuff the enemy, and Orc Shamans to provide buffs and dish out damage. Lastly, we have the most important hero option you should get, the River Troll Hags. They are a decent enough spellcaster and a pretty good melee combatant. But the reason they are the best hero option for you is because they provide you with an increase to your replenishment, which is extremely important for the Greenskins, as currently they have very few ways of increasing it. And finally, we have come to the army section of the video, and here there is pretty much nothing that is standard about these armies. But most of your armies are gonna be either monster spams, goblin spams, orc spams, or some mixture of the three. Let's start with the goblin spam armies first, for which I should also mention that you want to be recruiting heroes that have the Mushroom Addict trait to lower the upkeep cost of these armies by 15%. And they should also either be led by a Goblin Shaman, if it is a regular Goblin army, or a Night Goblin War Boss, if it is a Night Goblin or Squig army. Here you have the early game Goblin army that will consist of just regular goblins or the version with spears, and either some Goblin archers when going up against enemies with large monsters, or some pump wagons when going up against enemies that have lots of range units. These armies are ones you should be able to build almost anywhere you go, and you should be able to easily replace their units when they die. And trust me, they will be doing a lot of that. Now, these armies are pretty much nothing special, but can be mass-produced and will usually perform better than what you would expect. But they do require you to bring multiple of these armies to reliably win battles. You'll basically recruit these armies only in the very beginning of a campaign, and will gradually replace their units for better ones later on. Next up are Nasty Skulker spam armies, led by a Goblin Shaman. Now, these armies are a pale imitation of what they once were, but they are still relatively good and can be really strong on the battlefield, so long as you use them properly. Just don't expect too much from them. You can also replace up to a third of the Nasty Skulkers with monstrous units, such as Colossal Squigs or Stone Trolls, which are gonna do a fine job in dishing out damage and tying down enemy units in melee, while your Nasty Skulkers flank and kill the enemy range. You can also mix in a couple of Night Goblin Fanatics to get the Spinning Loons ability, which will help you in dishing out damage against enemy infantry. And the final Goblin army to mention are going to be the Squig Opper armies. Now, these armies were good previously, but they were outshined by Nasty Skulkers, which is why you almost never wanted to recruit them. Now, however, since the nerfs to goblins across the board, Squig Arpers were barely touched. In fact, I think they can actually get more bonuses now than previously. They get heavily buffed by the Night Goblin War Boss, who you want to have lead these armies. And they can get some really good bonuses from the new Night Goblin Big Bosses. Overall, these armies are extremely fast, with good killing power versus infantry. But they will struggle when fighting against single entities. So it is usually a good idea to embed a couple of Black Orc Big Bosses to help you out in that regard, or get a few Colossal Squigs. You could alternatively make half the army be Goblin Trash to tie up the enemy, and have your Squigs move around the battlefield more freely, but I would personally just go full Squig. Then we have come to the Orc armies, which you will want to always either be led by a Savage Orc Shaman, or if you insist, a War Boss. And here, there are only two armies that I would recommend you get. The first one is a regular Big Gun army, consisting of 8 to 10 units of Orc Boy Big Guns, a couple of River Trolls to provide some debuffs to the enemy, and the rest should either be Boar Boy Chariots or Boar Boy Big Guns. This is basically the same as every other melee-focused army you would build, just a unit that will go into melee head first, and a few units to run down enemy range. The second one will basically be the same, except you will get the Savage Orc version, and they have to be led by a Savage Orc Shaman. These armies will perform much better in the later stages of a campaign, when you're able to buff them massively, and your enemies start getting lots of armor-piercing damage. But unfortunately, they will struggle against units that have magic attack. Alternatively to these two, you could just go full Boar Boy spam armies, either Savage or regular, both are pretty good. Or, instead of getting any cavalry, you could just get monstrous units instead to support your Orc infantry. Lastly, when it comes to your monstrous armies, well, these are all pretty much just Doomstacks. And there are only 3 that are actually good for every single lord in the game, and 1 that is unique for Gorbad. First up are Colossal Squig Spam armies, which are really amazing. They have 90 speed and have amazing damage. But you will need a few Night Goblin Big Bosses to keep them from rampaging. Stone Troll Doomstacks, which are almost unstoppable once you get all their buffs from their technologies and scrap upgrades. Arachnarok Flinger Doomstacks, which are pretty much going to perform amazingly well no matter which enemy you face. But you may also want to embed Snagla into one of these armies to buff them up even further. Lastly, we have the self-cannibalistic Giants Doomstack that you can make when playing with Gorbad specifically, as he will provide you with one of his tactics that lets giants heal. And that would be all I had to share with you when it comes to the Greenskins units. If you enjoyed this one and would like to watch more of these, don't forget to subscribe for future content. Thank you all for watching, and until next time.
Khorne fights as one.